proud of our librarian who has been here with us. And we were just talking about this she started volunteering with us 10 years ago. And has not been continuous 10 years. It's on and off for the last 10 years been back here, but we are so proud to be home to such a talented writer. Such great writing has come from this amazing woman. And I can't say it enough times, we are just very proud to be home. So thank you, Abby, for choosing Gilford Library. You'll hear more about her writing, and the books will be on sale in back after she does her presentation. Other than that, I don't think that she really needs an introduction other than she lives here in town, right on Belknap Mountain Road, and rides her bike to work. She's only here now for 12 hours, so we still have her, she still has her foot in the door here, but she makes her living as a full-time writer for the most part. Yay. All right, well, thank you, Abby. Oh, one thing I wanted to say. That when her book was coming out, she doesn't really like to talk about it with the librarians, and we don't really like to ask about it too much because, it might stress her out. But we do have a couple publications that we look at for all of our book reviews. And the first one that came out is Booklist, which is, we really look at Booklist to determine what books we want to select for the library. And I was so happy for Abby that it came with a starred review from this major publication. Oh, wow. And it says, "Tantalizing, Maxwell has written a deeply satisfying, haunting work of literary fiction, driven by characters who are uniformly engaging and beautifully realized. It is not to be missed." So even if Abby had not been here at the library, we would have bought her book no matter where she would have been.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out. I feel so grateful. I've been saying this every time at every reading on this little tour that I've been doing, but it's so true that I feel so grateful to spend so much of my life in fiction. And it's also really, really hard to make that same totally illogical decision day after day. And it means so much to me to come out and have people, to see people who come out for books and who support that ridiculous pursuit. So thank you so much. So of course I'm gonna talk and read from The Den tonight. So The Den moves between two time periods, the 1980s through the present, and the middle of the my brain's a little messed up right now because I'm a little sick. So let me just start that over. The 1980s through the present and the middle of the 1800s. So in both time periods, it follows a set of sisters, one of whom goes missing from each time period. And the sisters are connected by the fact that they live on the same land, but 150 years apart, and also by this strange story in their town history book about a family that disappears and coyotes appear. So there are 4 narrators in the book, each sister, and tonight I'm going to read from 2 of them. But first I wanted to talk a little bit just about the process of writing the book, because I think that when we have these finished, beautifully bound books, it masks what a disaster the process really is. And it really is a disaster for me. So I began this book with images, the way that I begin all of my stories. So this one was a barn and an old foundation, sounds of coyotes at night, and then just like a mishmash of New Hampshire rundown factory towns and the woods. So I began there, and I just sort of moved along blindfolded, which is what I always do. But this process was particularly difficult with this book because I was pregnant when I began, and once my son was born, I entered a period of sleep deprivation that lasted literally 5 years, and that's how long it took to then complete the book. And in addition to that, I was raised by a single mother who taught me about all these paths for equity for women. And I'd spent years identifying as a feminist, and I'd taken feminism courses in college, but I had never once truly, really considered what a woman gives up in her body and in her mind in order to have and raise a child. And that seems just insane to me now, that I hadn't. But so as soon as I did that, as soon as I had a child, I felt totally shocked by the inequality of all of it. My husband was also shocked, and so at home we would raise our son and discuss the intricacies of the patriarchy and how we might move forward as a family out of it. And then I would go to whatever space that I had carved out to write, and I would just lie on the floor and stare at the ceiling and drift in and out of consciousness. And then I would jump up to write some pages, and then I would lie back down. And I know a lot of that had to do with my lack of sleep, but I think that it was also the weight of all those conversations. So after a few years into the book, I knew what I was doing structurally. But it wasn't until my agent finally read the book and she said to me, "Hey, this reminds me of The Scarlet Letter. Have you ever read that?" And I had, but I really only remembered the mystical woods of the book, so I reread that, and that's when I really realized what I had been wrestling with thematically. So in literature, we so often see what happens to a woman for her sexual transgressions. She dies while the men suffer nothing. And in fact, what they've done isn't even called a transgression. But Hester of The Scarlet Letter, she lives, and I wanted to create some different path too. I wanted girls who not only fail to internalize the messages around shame and self-worth that a girl so often receives, but who, once society has punished them, still carve out some sense of freedom, despite the fact that they are within a system designed to deny them of it. So once the book was printed and once the book was complete and the galleys printed, that's this, so the first time it looks like a book. Once that was done, I got to read this beautiful letter that my editor had written about the book. And it wasn't until then that I finally fully saw that I'd written a book in which society responds in the same way to the sexual transgressions of two different women, despite the fact that they're a century and a half apart. I didn't do that on purpose. I just wrote what I knew would happen to these characters. But now I'm really thankful that all those endless conversations with my husband went somewhere. I was afraid that it would have to be saved for the next project. So I'm going to read from those two time periods. I'm going to start at the beginning of the book, which is really was also the beginning of my process with this book. And that's from a woman named Jane's section, and this section is like early 1990s. And she's looking on at her sister Henrietta. And then I'll skip ahead and just read a few sections from a few pages from Elsbeth's section, which is in the 1850s. And then when I'm done, if people have questions, I'd love to try to discuss them. And the reading takes about 20 minutes, just so you know. Sometimes I think it's awful to sit there thinking, how long? Late June, an afternoon some 20 years ago, the fact that my sister could disappear, not even a speck in my consciousness yet. The sun was high and shining, and Henrietta and I were just about to see Kaus, the one who started all of this, for the very first time. We had some money, I don't know how, we weren't babysitting yet, and because it was summer, we had the time. Our father worked, and our mother shut herself off in her studio on the 3rd floor, so there was no one to stop us from going to the little store to buy candy. The owner kept a rack of smut right there in the open, and for this reason our father had prohibited us from entering, but no matter. This was the summer my sister had turned 15, started wearing an underwire bra, blow-drying her hair, and saying easily, la-dee-da, to every command our parents gave. Anyway, we didn't look at the smut, just bought our candy, loads of it, then walked on. I had thought we were headed home, but when we reached the abandoned mill, my sister didn't lead us back over the bridge, but instead a little farther along. She strutted a few paces ahead of me as we went, and both of us stuffed our mouths. I can still remember the strange coating all that sugar gave my tongue. Eventually, we reached Church Street, which was not a street I had walked before. It ran along the river, and the far side of the road was crowded with a thick line of trailers. I knew I ought not to stare, but just the same I could not stop myself from taking in long, aching glances of life over there. We lived in an old farmhouse on a virtually empty road, so this hubbub seemed a dream. Women were out in their lawn chairs with cigarettes and portable phones and magazines. Babies were in plastic pools, and everyone, from my view, was loud and happy. The sun was at our backs, and before us stood the trestle, which was yet another place we were not supposed to go. That abandoned railroad bridge rises roughly 40 feet above the river, and it continues to be the spot where all the bad kids congregate to smoke and spit and jump into the water all summer long. The bridge's iron trusses run beneath the tracks, and on that day with my sister, their X's seemed to gleam like the most tantalizing of warnings. The reflection of the trees, pines mostly, and maples, danced upon the water, and I wanted desperately to join with them in that cool, fresh place. And so I was shocked and disappointed when I looked ahead and saw that as Henrietta walked, she let all her candy wrappers fall in her wake, then blow over the bank toward the river. "Litter bug," I scolded her. She didn't respond, so I repeated myself, and when she still didn't respond, I just kept at it. Not yelling, because I didn't want to be heard by the neighborhood, but hissing. Loud enough, surely, for Henrietta to hear over the river. Still, she went right on ignoring me. I knew that if I really cared, I could have just picked her trash up for her and dealt with the injustice of it later. But I was getting angry. We both had thin hair, mine mousy and nondescript, and Henrietta's, back then, a dark, shining brown that somehow hid the thinness. Her hair was long, too, so when I could bear her haughty strut no longer, I reached forward and tugged. When my sister spun around, that hair flew up, encircled her pointed face, and remained, a momentary defeat of gravity. I had a flash just then of my Henrietta transforming into a wild, yellow-eyed animal. She didn't say a word, just grabbed my bare arm and pulled me toward her. She kept holding on to me, and her nails began to dig into my skin. I wanted to call out, but I understood this as her vicious command to shut up. We had come to a red, 2-story house that didn't quite fit in. It wasn't a trailer, there was that, but there was also something uncanny about the place. Where all other yards on the street were small and crowded with people, this one was oddly spacious and vacant. The curtains were drawn and the windows closed. I would have thought that the house itself was empty, had Henrietta not waited there so expectantly. But there we stood, together in the loudest of silences, until a teenage boy emerged from the house and stood on the front step, bathing in the sun's rays. Kaus. According to Henrietta, this was the first time she'd ever seen him, though she too must have been a liar. He stood there gazing toward the river while we stood there gazing at him, And then he shifted and withdrew a cigarette from a pack in the pocket of his cut-off jean shorts with a motion so fluid it was preternatural. Despite the breeze that skimmed up off the river, he lit it the first time he tried, and then that boy walked our way. He didn't speak to us, and we didn't speak to him. Still, his intention was clear. Kaus cut across the street to walk right by Henrietta, and as he passed her, he turned his head and blew a long, gentle stream of smoke her way. And my sister, she cocked her head and opened her thin lips and drew it right in. We didn't make it to the trestle that day. My sister just turned me around and led me back home. That night, when I took my bath, I saw that she had left 5 little welts on my upper arm, a sign, I later decided, of the beginning of the end. Our house was a half a mile up the hill from town. The way our parents told the story, they had gone for a drive through the countryside when they were young and in love, and had passed our house for the very first time. Or a barn, really, because the barn was the thing. It was the largest in the entire county, and it was the whole reason we had ever ended up on this land in the first place. On that drive, our father had pulled over and walked right onto the property without worrying over whether or not anyone lived there. No one did. And he ran his hands over the barn shingles as though they were the skin of a lover. "Hand-hewn beams," he said when he slid the door open. "And Christ, that one still extends nearly 70 feet. Our mother, once brave enough, tiptoed to the house and peered in the windows. "That God-forsaken wallpaper," she would say when our father told the story. At the time, Henrietta was in her belly, taking hold of life, though my mother didn't know it yet. They went home to their apartment in the little city to the south, and our father lay on their mattress on the floor and dreamed aloud, and our mother, because she just wanted sleep, said something like, "For Christ's sake, Charlie, then do it," without thinking he ever would. A week later, they owned the place, the down payment made with the bit of inheritance they had received from our father's parents. The floors were dirt, and the stairs, our mother claimed, were planks weaker than her own hands. But it was cheap and, as our father said, it was theirs. Our father did not make much money. He was a cook, and eventually the head cook at the hospital. But with that house and barn, he had his dream, and I suppose that is why he seemed compelled to sacrifice all else in order to give our mother her dream too. He supported her choice to stay at home while we went to school, despite the fact that in addition to working, it was also he who cooked, cleaned, and performed nearly all other household tasks. But our mother was an artist, a painter, though she rarely ever sold a piece, and a woman who, I am sure, never fully wanted children. This fact kept her at a remove, and at night, when dinner was through and the dishes were done, she would open the family heirloom box of real silver, remove the velvet caddy that held the dinnerware, and reach into the bottom, beneath the velvet sheath of grapefruit spoons. There she would find one of her thin joints. She would swipe a wooden match across the top of the wood stove, take a few puffs, and then our mother would transform into a woman so distant and so fully within herself that Henrietta and I, spying from the top of the staircase, would be stunned and overcome with a disconcerting mix of desperation to be seen by her and to disappear and become her. "Sylvia," our father would sometimes say, and each time I heard that, her first name, a little swell of fear would rise up in me. Sylvia, a name so singular, so volatile. Not our mother, but a woman who, at any moment, could leave this little life of ours. Henrietta, though, the fact that she, her whole self, spirit and body and all, could leave our life, that had never occurred to me, not yet. I was 12 years old that summer of Kaus, and always I told my sister everything I had to tell. I would have told her anything at all. And I knew my sister, Through and through I did. She had perpetually tanned skin and short toes. Her thumbs arched gloriously backward, and she was double jointed in her fingers, so that she could bend the top portion of each finger downward while keeping the rest of it perfectly straight. At night, she stuck her chewed gum to her headboard, and she could sniff a thin rope up through her left nostril and pull it out through her right one. She could do a back bend and 3 perfect cartwheels in a row, and even a front handspring. She dreamed about boys, not smut dreams as she called them, but just peaceful little dreams in which she and a boy would drift along in a rowboat or walk hand in hand. She also dreamed about riding horses, and in nightmares she dreamed that a giant wave crashed over her. But that summer, after I saw that boy, I had the strange sensation of beginning to realize something that I had always known. My sister. There was a layer to her, invisible but palpable as her skin itself, that would not ever be open to me. The day after I saw him for the very first time, my sister dragged me along with her to town once again. Typically, I would have gone without hesitation, but on that day I'd happened to be immersed in a new book, Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews. I'd stayed up half the night with that book, feeling I'd better finish it before my parents came to their senses and tore it from my hands. I wasn't finished when Henrietta showed up at my door to drag me into town, and I would have just as soon kept on reading. But Henrietta told me to go with her, and so I went. She vomited before we left the house. This, of course, was early in the mess, so I hadn't quite caught on yet. Maybe I didn't want to. I said, "Don't you want to lie down?" or something of that nature. And then, eventually, when she shuffled me out the front door, well, I better not catch it. "Can't catch hotness, sister," she said, and tossed her hair back. I followed her as she strutted down the center of our road like she owned it, her newfound maturity made even more brazen overnight. When a car rolled toward us, Henrietta didn't even move out of the way. It was Mr. Cutler, our only neighbor, whose house lay up the hill, just barely out of sight. We had always known him, at least vaguely, but he was a strange, overeager man whom we did our best to avoid. He must have been in his 50s, yet despite his age, when he caught us on the road, he would always ask us what was new and cool. "Are these jeans cool?" he would say. "What music are the kids listening to these days anyway?" Today he leaned out the window of his yellow sports car and he said to Henrietta, "You have yourself a boyfriend yet?" The question alone surprised me, but when she responded simply that she did, my jaw dropped. Mr. Cutler let a smile spread over his clean-shaven face, and then he eased his car down the hill and out of sight. My sister continued walking. I scurried after her, calling, "That boy's your boyfriend? The one from the red house? How do you know he's your boyfriend?" Plus a handful more varieties of the same question, none of which she would answer. She just waltzed ahead of me while I followed like a dog, over the bridge and into town. I never did figure out what exactly made Henrietta go to that little store on a daily basis in the early days of that summer. On that first day after Caus, though, rather than going straight in as we always had, my sister just leaned against the building and bent one leg up so that her foot rested flatly against the brick. She tilted her head back, very exhausted, very adult, and she said, "God, I could kill for a cigarette." I don't know that I said anything to that. I don't know that I could overcome my shock in order to do so. She said, "God, what? And don't look at me like that." And then, as insurance against my tattling, she marched right into that store and spent $5 whole on 500 Sour Patch Kids for me. In the previous school year, I had entered the upper middle school, a building shared with the high school, and there I had come to understand that my sister was not popular. Henry Schmetta, they called her, and Harry Etta, and the worst, born from nothing I knew of, Bloody Harry Letta. my sister, thin and wispy, made of wind. When she was mocked, she would steadfastly look the accuser in the eye. It was a powerful, deadening look, one she had learned from our mother, and cruel though it was, it only increased my awe of her. I was bewitched by my sister, loved her to a dangerous degree. So, excuse me. So that is Jane looking on at Henrietta. Henrietta, who is clearly headed for trouble. So, just after that section, you see their father telling them this story that is in their town history book that they've really grown up with and heard just like a family story over and over again. And the story is called, or the story's about this place that they call the Den, which is a foundation in the woods where, like I said before, the family disappears and coyotes appear. So that foundation is actually in their woods. So now I'm going to skip ahead to Elsbeth's section. Elsbeth is in the 1850s, and Elsbeth is the mother of the woman who's also the mother of the family that lived in the house before it fell down and became a foundation. Okay, so these are the actual people who lived there. And this is really just about 3 pages that I'll read from her section. Elsbeth. In her old life, she never rose before the sun came in, even if it meant her mother would scold her. But her sister, Claire, would cover for her anyway. Her sister had understood her, or, if not understood, at least loved her so completely that she accepted her faults, supreme laziness among them. Half the time, her sister would do all the chores for them. She realized in her new life that it must have been a terrible burden. When she listed it, it all sounded like so much. Collect the water, clean the floors and windows, clean the laundry, tend the gardens, tend the chickens, buy the food, cook the food, that sort of thing, all on top of the spinning. Spin the flax, spin the flax, spin the flax until you lose your mind. But back then, even when she did keep right up with her hardworking sister, it never felt like so much at all. Never near as much as the burden she felt since she'd crossed the ocean. But even she had to admit that this new life wasn't so terribly bad. For years, she had kept a routine that her sister could scarcely believe. She rose with the 4:30 a.m. mill bell, and once her husband set out for work, she sat at the table with her candle and wrote letters home until daybreak, when her boys stirred. Letters to her sister, to her parents, to the friends she'd left behind. It astonished her, sometimes, that there was an entire ocean between them, and sometimes it astonished her that there was only an ocean. She could just get on a boat, she thought sometimes. It was the 1850s, she thought constantly toward the end. People crossed the ocean every single day. She herself had crossed the ocean. To get back would not be impossible, not like trying to cross into heaven or hell or some other realm she couldn't believe in. It was in the morning, with her letters, that she had thoughts like this. It was when her boys, the 3 of them, were still sleeping. The oldest and the youngest slept silently, but she had always been able to hear the middle one's labored breath at night. It wasn't a snore, but something at once softer and more hard-earned. "He sounds like a damn river," her husband once said, but that hadn't seemed accurate to her, because a river never sounded like it had to try quite so hard. She didn't mind the sound, though. Years ago, she'd asked a visiting doctor what might be the problem, or if in fact it was a problem at all. But he had said that in order to find out, her little boy would have to spend the night with the doctor for observation. That had been the end of that. Eventually, the sound became a light blanket to her, a kind of steady comfort in this new world. Her husband had come over first. Lots of people were doing that at the time, and she hadn't wanted to be like them in that way, or in any way, really, but it had been decided. He took a boat over, But when he arrived, he learned that the mill he had meant to work for had just suffered a great flood, and so he followed another freshly arrived Scot north, to the country, to a small town with a new mill, where he found a job and home at once. Hardly 3 months later, she received a letter saying he was settled in a place called Middlewood. She wasn't sure if it was luck or fortitude, but either way, she was proud of him for getting there. With that first letter, he had also sent a real present across the ocean for her, a brooch made of seed pearls. She had never owned such an exquisite piece of jewelry, not any jewelry at all, in fact. And the gift told her that mill workers in the new country were not like mill workers in Scotland, that in the new country they were of another class, and that when she left her home, she would enter not only a new world, but a new self entirely. That letter and that gift gave her the sense that she would no longer be of the weavers, but a woman in a grand house with a library and a china tea set, woolen carpets, canopy beds, and artwork from France hung on the walls. But it was all only daydreams. She liked to imagine it, but she never truly wanted such a life. It could not possibly be enough to make up for such loss. She didn't want to go. In those final days before she went, she would walk up to the edge of the sand and lie right down, as much as she could despite her belly, and dig her fingers through the sharp grass, all the way into the ground. She would splash the ocean water on her bare face and hair. She would smell everything in those days too. That grass and sand and water, but also the table they ate on, the spot of earth where the rose bushes grew, and the roses themselves, of course. Her mother's neck and her sister's neck, her pillow, her blanket, even her cottage wall, cataloging it all before departure. It turned out that she would wish she hadn't done that, because those smells had been stored away, yet she would never be able to quite reach them. In the new country, it was enough to drive her mad sometimes. Why hadn't it felt that way to her husband, too? He had come from the very same place. Surely he had known the land as much as she had, yet not as she had, she came to realize. The land of home had never been his dream. Business, that's what he was interested in. You'd think she would have known it when they began, what with the way he'd talked about running the foundry one day, but then she had scarcely known a thing. There had never been a time they hadn't been acquainted, but then one day when she was 16 years old, she'd noticed he was standing across the street, behind the blooming lilacs, watching her as she pumped the water. The next day she noticed he was back again. "What do you want?" she had asked him. "Why aren't you working?" "Lunchtime." "Why aren't you at lunch?" "I came to tell you something." "Out with it then." "I love you," he had shouted across the oddly empty street, and she had laughed. He went red, of course, yet amazingly he had not skittered away, so she crossed over to him and apologized. Together they walked back toward her house, and when they got near enough, they ducked into the yard. She had done plenty of reading by this time, romance and horror mostly. She thought of the helpless people in those stories, and she looked up at him and willed him to be brave, but nothing happened. She was due back with the water, but she didn't want to go back after such a letdown. She said quickly, "If you love me, kiss me," and he had. The kiss seemed to go on, though perhaps it was only 1 second. The bell for the foundry rang, and he ran off to work. She picked up her water pails, light as feathers, for she had been lifted right up. She practically skipped in the door, practically spilled the water, too. Her sister scolded her, but it did nothing to lower her mood. She hummed. After that day, the two of them met everywhere, every free moment they could find. They lied to their families to do it, of course. Said they were visiting this or that friend, or said they were slowed down with an errand because of this or that mishap. They met on the beaches, they met in the woods. She wanted to tell her sister, but then her sister might have called her a sinner. Though her whole family attended church, so far as she saw, it was only Claire who prayed daily. Only Claire who dusted and polished the cross. Elsbeth herself felt no such calling. Anyway, was love a sin? And if she were a sinner, why would she feel so wonderful? She promised herself that she would marry Thomas, and she comforted herself with the fact that though they would never admit it, her father and even her mother seemed to care more for Wordsworth than for the Bible. Sometimes she and Thomas would meet in an old misshapen tree with branches long and wide enough to stretch right out on. She would lie back, and he would run his hands over the length of her feet, up her legs, and in time, under her linen dress. She eventually stopped wearing undergarments for this very purpose, and even though they understood just how a baby was made, in time they did what they knew they probably shouldn't do. They were 17 years old by then. Nothing happened, not that time, so they had kept on. Nothing happened, and then suddenly something did. She told her family right away, and as expected, her father demanded that she get married. And then, after thinking it over for a few days, it was her father who had said she and her future husband had better take up with the group going to America. Thank you. Questions if people have questions. That's kind of the most fun part of these things. If anyone has questions, yeah.
That's a much longer book than your excerpt is, so.
Yeah.
Why are those two excerpts that you read, how did you choose them, and what is the reason you did?
Well, I chose the first one because I just always like to start at the beginning, and I feel like I would sort of stumble if I tried to catch people up and have a scene that makes sense. So I wanted to start at the beginning, and then I wanted to just give more of a sense of the breadth of the book, so to go back into the 1800s time. And that's the first section that goes back into the 1800s, and I think the other sections of that time period, I have to do a lot of catch up first. So, yeah.
Yeah, Wendy. Do you have a character that's a favorite that you're most endeared to?
So Henrietta, who's the one that Jane is looking on at and describing in that first section I read, I think she is maybe my favorite. She's very, very loosely based, or not based, but inspired by my stepsister, who, when we were children, she was just this like wild, larger than life, really brave girl, and I was so enamored of her and so different from her, but she had a personality that I think girls aren't really allowed to have, and I really wanted her, and she does later in the book, to kind of get her say, her perspective. So I think she's kind of my favorite. Yeah.
Henrietta's boyfriend, that was a name, at least to me, I had never heard before.
Yeah.
So it's pronounced, you said?
Kaus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where does that?
From Laos. So when I was a child, I grew up in Tilton, the Winnisquam School District, and it's just all white, and we had never seen anybody from anywhere else, and then a big group of people from Laos moved in, and that just, I don't know, for some reason just always stuck in my mind, like just different bits and pieces about just like what happened to them or the way they were treated and stuff, so that just stuck in my mind. Although that wasn't the first, he just sort of arrived when I was writing her character as her boyfriend, and then that developed.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, Mark.
I love the surrealism. How did you decide to do the coyote transformation or whatever it is that happened there? Where'd you get that idea from?
I also love that, and I really want to be able to write a book that goes like more deeply into that kind of thing. But with this one, I mean, I think that, well, for one, I think that in everything I write, I am trying to make sense of things in the way that fairy tales do. And so I'm just drawn to that impossibility. It's not something that I believe in, but I think that it provides a narrative to the senselessness of a lot of tragedy in life. And so I think I'm just drawn to that. And then the coyotes specifically, part of it came from when I was at the beginning of this book. I spent a lot of time upstairs in the New Hampshire room, and one of the books up there is this big old book of the history of Samerton, which is like the town line that my mom's house is on. And that's like this really strange book that has lots of random details in it. And there were a lot of things in there about people trying to trap wolves. And so I was just thinking about all those stories, and meanwhile was hearing these wild sounds of coyotes like all night long. And I would be up with my baby and just hearing these coyotes, and that's sort of where it came from, I guess. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so when you're developing your characters, so they kind of appear in your imagination.
Yeah.
Do they come in a sequence? I mean, did Henrietta come first, or I mean, did they just?
Right.
Or the idea of the two different time periods, how did that evolve with the
Right.
characters?
Yeah. So the voice that I read first, Jane, her voice came first, but it was an image of Henrietta that came first. So I guess I always knew that there was this young girl, and the image in my mind was that she was in this barn and she was having her first sexual experience, but it was this situation in which she was like in total control of the situation, but very young. And so I had this image of her, but I always knew she was being watched, and it was filtered through somebody else. And that was the voice of Jane, and that's the first thing that I did. And Henrietta, of course, disappears. You hear that in the first sentence. So I was working on the book and writing Jane's perspective, and then I was like, I just cannot keep going and have an entire book of this woman pining for her missing sister. It's just a total slog for me and for anybody else. And I was really stuck. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I need to follow Henrietta and see what her real story is and see her side of things. So I did that. And then I was then stuck again for a few more years. And I was sitting at the lake one day and just like looking at the water thinking, I'm never ever going to finish this book. I'm going to throw it out. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, they've got this story from their town history book, but somebody wrote that story. So who wrote that story? What were the circumstances of it? And what was the truth of that family? And at that point I backed up. And that's when the book really opened up for me. So, yeah. Yeah.
Do you bounce ideas off your husband as you're talking about?
No. No.
I mean, you were stuck for 2 years. I didn't know if you maybe talked to anybody. Or,
I don't talk to anybody about being stuck. I mostly just kind of take walks and also like look at other books.
Oh, okay.
And also like look at interviews from my favorite writers, and they talk about what they do when they're stuck.
Oh.
But yeah, I don't think I really do. I show him when I think I'm done.
Oh.
But so.
Well, no, it's your own mind, your own thought process. Right?
Yeah. I mean, he knows what I'm working on, but yeah, I don't think I do.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I have a question about the coyotes.
Yeah.
When you say in the 1850s that family disappears, and the coyotes, do they kind of mythically replace them? Or where do they come in?
Yeah, I can't answer that question. But I will say that not here at this point. They were in the West, but they weren't here in the 1850s. But yeah, so that's something that, and the woman Jane, whose perspective you heard first, she as an adult is married to a man who knows a lot about wildlife biology. He's a wildlife biologist, and he is telling her the story can't be true, that coyotes came because coyotes weren't here. And so she kind of tries to figure out that mystery.
I guess I'll have to get
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Yeah.